The icy wind screamed through the valley, slamming a loose shutter against the rotting timber of the Mercer house like a gavel sealing a verdict. Inside Evangeline. Eva Mercer pressed her back against the cold kitchen wall, her knuckles white around a heavy iron poker as shadows stretched across the floor. Outside, heavy boots crunched through the freezing crust of snow, slow, deliberate, and entirely uninvited. She held her breath, every nerve strained toward the back door's rusted latch. 8 years of surviving Oak Haven's quiet malice had taught her that danger here rarely wore a hood. It wore a fine wool coat and brought a quiet threat. When the door handle slowly turned, the metal groaned under pressure. Eva did not scream. Fear was a luxury she had burned away years ago alongside her family's pride in the ashes of the Montgomery cider mill. She lowered the poker only when the heavy oak door swung open to reveal Silas Vance, his broad shoulders dusted with fresh snow and his hands raised in a silent, placating gesture. He carried an armful of chopped hickory wood, his breathing steady despite the biting cold. "It's just me, Eva," Silas said softly, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that seemed to absorb the room's tension. "The storm's turning bad. I wanted to make sure the stove stayed lit through the night." Eva let out a long, slow exhale, setting the iron poker back beside the hearth. "You shouldn't be here, Silas. If anyone from the town sees your truck parked by my gate, they'll have fresh gossip for tomorrow's Sunday social. Let them talk." Silas replied simply, setting the wood down by the stone fireplace with practiced, quiet care. "Mabel Pruitt's store has been running low on scandal anyway. A deputy's son helping a neighbor won't break her counter." The kitchen returned to its hollow silence save for the crackle of pine kindling catching fire in the belly of the iron stove. The house at the edge of Oak Haven, Virginia, had once been filled with the scent of dried apples, beeswax, and her father's pipe tobacco. Now, in the winter of 1982, it smelled of damp wool, old paper, and impending departure. 2 worn leather suitcases stood by the door, their straps buckled tight. After 8 grueling years of paying off her late father's alleged debts, the bank had finally foreclosed on the Mercer homestead. The property was slated for public auction by the end of the month, stripped of whatever warmth it once held. Silas poured 2 dented tin cups of black coffee from the pot resting on the stove. Handing one to Eva, she wrapped her calloused fingers around the tin, absorbing the heat. For 3 years, ever since Silas had quietly stepped away from his role as deputy to work as a town mechanic, this had been their unspoken ritual. He would show up under the guise of repairing a leaking roof, replacing broken window panes, or hauling firewood, and they would share a cup of coffee in total, comfortable silence. "The early bus to Richmond leaves at 6 tomorrow morning," Eva said quietly, staring into the dark surface of her cup. "I spoke to the driver today. He said he'd stop at the crossroads if the snow doesn't block the ridge." Silas took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes fixed on the flames behind the stove's iron grate. How was 39 a man built from hard labor and silent burdens, his face etched with lines that belonged to someone much older? Underneath the third-person gaze of the quiet room, his internal struggle was palpable. He wanted to reach out to place a hand over hers, to give her a reason, any reason, to stay in the Shenandoah Valley. But the weight of his own humble standing, as a local handyman, paired with a darker, unconfessed shadow tied to his late father's legacy, kept his boots anchored to the floorboards. "Richmond is a big city, Eva," Silas said softly. "It's different from the valley. People there don't know the Mercer name, but they don't know you either." "That's precisely why I'm going," Eva replied, her voice firm, yet tinged with an underlying sorrow. "In Oak Haven, I am only ever Henry Mercer's daughter, the girl whose father stole $50,000 and burned a man alive in the cider mill." 8 years, Silas. 8 years of turned heads at the market, whispered curses when I walked down Main Street, and doors slamming in my face. My father died in that cold prison cell 4 years ago, swearing he was innocent, but this town buried us both the day they locked him up. Silas tightened his grip on his mug until his knuckles turned pale. He knew every word she said was true. Oak Haven was a traditional southern town where roots ran deep but grudges ran deeper. When the Montgomery cider mill burned down in 1974, Harrison Montgomery, the wealthiest man in the county, had pointed the finger at Henry Mercer, the quiet head accountant, who maintained the books. The evidence had been neat, swift, and devastating. "Your father was a good man, Eva," Silas said, his voice dropping an octave. "A patient man. A dead man." Eva corrected, setting her cup down on the wooden table with a soft clatter. "And tomorrow I stop living under his ghost. I've restored every piece of furniture I could sell, paid every back tax the county demanded, and now there is nothing left for me here." She looked at Silas, her dark eyes searching his rugged face for something she hadn't dared to name in 3 years. She had come to rely on his quiet presence, his gentle strength, and the way he looked at her when he thought she was focused on her work. A look that felt like safety in a world that offered none. But he had never made a move, never spoken a word of affection, remaining as distant as the snow-capped Blue Ridge Mountains. Silas stood up, pulling his heavy canvas coat tighter around his chest. He walked toward the door, his boots heavy against the floor. He opened the latch, letting in a gust of freezing wind that made the oil lamp flicker on the table. "I'll drive you to the crossroads at 5:30. Silas said, keeping his back to her so she couldn't see the tension in his jaw. "The snow's going to drift across the lower lane by midnight. You won't be able to walk it with those bags." "You don't have to do that, Silas," she said softly. "I know," he replied, turning slightly to catch her gaze one last time. "Get some sleep, Eva." He stepped out into the howling storm, pulling the heavy oak door shut behind him. Outside, as the white flakes swirled around his old pickup truck, Silas didn't immediately get in. He stood in the freezing night, staring at the small, glowing window of the kitchen. In the pocket of his coat rested a small, heavy brass key he had taken from his father's old workbench that afternoon. A key that belonged to a sealed tin box hidden beneath the floorboards of his workshop. He knew that inside that box lay secrets about the night of the fire, secrets his father, the former deputy sheriff, had taken to his grave. Silas closed his eyes against the biting wind, knowing that tomorrow morning, when that bus arrived at the crossroads, he would have to make a choice that would either set Evangeline free or shatter whatever was left of her world forever. The first light of dawn did not bring warmth to the Shenandoah Valley. It only turned the snow a pale, bruised purple. By 5 in the morning, the wind had died down to a low whistle, but the cold remained absolute, seeping through the floorboards of the Mercer homestead like an unwelcome guest. Inside her bedroom, Eva Mercer smoothed down the skirts of her wool dress, her hands steady despite the chill. She reached for the small brass locket on her nightstand, opening it to gaze one last time at the fading photograph of her father, Henry Mercer. His gentle, scholarly eyes stared back at her, the eyes of a man who spent his weekends binding old church hymnals, not a murderer or a thief. She snapped the locket shut and walked into the kitchen, where the embers of last night's fire had turned to gray ash. The air was thick with the scent of pine and cold iron. Standing by the window, she watched a pair of headlights cut through the thick fog along the lane. Silas's rusted pickup truck groaned to a halt by the front gate, its engine sputtering against the freeze before dying out. Silas stepped into the yard, carrying the heavy silence that always seemed to surround him. As he walked toward the porch, the third-person vantage of the cold morning revealed a subtle shift in his bearing, a tightness around his eyes, a rigidness in his shoulders that went beyond the freezing temperature. In his heavy canvas coat pocket, his hand rested against the cool, rectangular weight of his father's sealed tin box. He had spent the long, sleepless hours of the night staring at it on his workbench, fighting the ghost of his father, the late Deputy Crane Vance, whose mind had unraveled into dementia long before his heart finally gave out. "The Ridge Road is clear enough for the bus," Silas said as he entered the kitchen, his breath blooming in white clouds. He picked up her 2 leather suitcases without being asked, his large calloused hands gripping the handles tightly. "We should head down to the crossroads now." Eva wrapped her thick scarf around her neck and took a final look at the empty room. "Thank you, Silas, for everything these past 3 years." They drove in silence down the winding dirt road toward Oak Haven's main artery. The town was just beginning to wake. Smoke curled lazily from the red brick chimneys of the valley's prominent families, but as they passed the edge of the business district, the shadow of the valley's true power came into view: the Montgomery Fruit Processing Plant. Its massive brick warehouses and towering silver silos dominated the landscape, a monument to Harrison Montgomery's absolute grip on the local economy. 8 years ago, it had been a modest cider mill. Today, rebuilt and expanded with a massive insurance payout following the fatal fire, it was the heartbeat of the county. Instead of turning directly toward the bus stop at the highway crossroads, Silas pulled the truck into the alleyway behind Eva's small restoration workshop, adjacent to the old town square. "Why are we stopping here?" Eva asked, her brows knitting in confusion. "The bus leaves in 20 minutes. "There's something you need to take with you," Silas said, keeping his eyes on the rearview mirror. "Or something you need to leave behind properly. Yesterday afternoon, Harrison Montgomery came by my garage. He asked if I knew whether you'd finished restoring your father's old Seth Thomas pendulum clock, the one from his office at the mill." Eva felt a cold prickle along her spine. "Harrison came to see you. He was at my shop 2 days ago offering to buy that clock for $300. He claimed it was out of charity, a piece of nostalgia from the old mill days. I told him it wasn't for sale. He asked me twice if you were taking it to Richmond with you," Silas said, his voice dropping to a cautious whisper. "Harrison Montgomery doesn't spend $300 on sentiment, Eva. He doesn't even spend 10 cents on it. A man like that only pays for things that pose a threat." Before Eva could process his words, the crunch of gravel heralded the arrival of a sleek, dark sedan. It pulled up alongside Silas's truck, blocking the alley exit. The driver's side door opened, and Harrison Montgomery stepped out into the crisp morning air. At 62, Harrison was the picture of Southern authority, dressed in a tailored wool overcoat, his silver hair neatly combed, his posture radiating unshakable confidence. "Good morning, Silas. Evangeline," Harrison said, stepping toward the truck, with a warm, practiced smile that didn't reach his sharp blue eyes. He tipped his hat respectfully toward Eva. "I saw your truck turning down the alley, Silas, and thought I'd catch Miss Mercer before she made her journey. It's a sad day for Oak Haven, seeing an old Valley family move on." "Mr. Montgomery," Eva said coldly, remaining inside the cab, "I have a bus to catch." Of course," Harrison replied smoothly, resting a leather-gloved hand on the truck's window frame. "I won't detain you. I merely wanted to renew my offer on your father's pendulum clock. 300 is a generous sum, Evangeline, more than enough to give you a comfortable cushion in Richmond. In fact, let's make it 500. I'll take it off your hands right now, save you the trouble of hauling heavy freight on the bus." The urgency beneath his polite tone was unmistakable to both Eva and Silas. It was the calculated pressure of a man accustomed to buying whatever he wanted and destroying what he couldn't. "The clock is packed in the crate in my workshop, Mr. Montgomery," Eva said, her voice laced with steel. "And as I told you before, it belonged to my father. It is the only thing I have left of his work. It is not for sale at any price." Harrison's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a flicker of cold, aristocratic disdain passing over his features before he recovered his composure. "A shame," he murmured softly. "Holding on to old relics often keeps old wounds open, my dear. Your father was a misguided man who made tragic choices. Carrying his ghost to Richmond won't bring you peace." "My father died an innocent man." Eva snapped her knuckles, whitening against her lap. "The court records said otherwise," Harrison said softly, taking a step back. "Safe travels, Evangeline. I hope the city gives you whatever it is you are searching for." Harrison returned to his sedan and backed out of the alleyway, leaving a cloud of exhaust hanging in the freezing air. Silas watched the car disappear down Main Street through his side mirror, his heart thumping heavily against his ribs. He turned to Eva, whose breath was coming in short, furious hitches. "He's afraid of that clock, Eva," Silas said quietly, his hand instinctively reaching into his coat pocket, his fingers wrapping around the small brass key. "Or he's afraid of what your father hid inside it before the fire." Eva looked at Silas, confusion and a sudden sharp anxiety rising in her chest. "What are you talking about? It's just a mahogany clock. We're not going to the bus stop yet," Silas declared, turning the ignition key. The engine roared back to life. "There's one more place we have to go first. My father's old cabin up on Ridge Road. Before he lost his mind to the sickness, he hid a sealed box beneath the floorboards. I unlocked it last night." Silas looked at her, his dark eyes filled with a painful mixture of dread and absolute resolve. "Harrison Montgomery isn't the only one who kept secrets in this valley, Eva. And before you leave Oak Haven forever, you deserve to know what my father helped him hide." The truck rattled up the winding, unpaved incline of Ridge Road, the tires churning through pristine drifts of snow. Inside the cab, the silence between Silas and Eva was no longer the comfortable quiet of shared coffee mornings. It was a tight, vibrating wire stretched to its snapping point. Eva kept her hands clamped over her lap, her eyes fixed on the pine trees passing like dark sentinels outside her window. The encounter with Harrison Montgomery in the alleyway had rattled her, but the look in Silas's eyes, a grim, tortured certainty, terrified her even more. Silas pulled the truck off the narrow trail, coming to a stop before a low-slung, weathered log cabin tucked into the shadow of the ridge. This had been Deputy Crane Vance's retreat, a secluded retreat, where a lawman had spent his final clouded years losing his grip on reality. Silas killed the engine, leaving only the metallic ticking of the cooling manifold in the bitter air. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a heavy rusted tin box, roughly the size of a ledger, along with a small brass key. He didn't look at Eva as he held the box resting across his knees. "My father started losing his memory in the winter of '76. Silas began, his voice barely louder than the wind, whispering through the pines. At first it was small things, forgetting where he left his spectacles, repeating stories at the diner. But then came the night terrors. He'd wake up screaming about fires, about ledgers, about a man begging for his daughter from behind iron bars. Eva turned slowly to face him, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Silas, what are you saying?" "When the Montgomery cider mill burned down 8 years ago, my father was the lead investigator," Silas said, finally turning his head to meet her gaze. His dark eyes were glossy with unspoken pain. "He was the one who found the planted cash in your father's desk. He was the one who signed the arrest warrant. The town called him a hero for bringing swift justice to a traitor. But 2 nights ago, while I was clearing out the floorboards beneath his old workbench in this cabin, I found this." With hands that shook despite his immense strength, Silas fitted the brass key into the tin box's lock. The tumbler yielded with a sharp, dry click. He lifted the lid. Inside lay 2 items, a leather-bound deputy's daily logbook from 1974 and a folded sheet of yellowed notebook paper sealed with a wax stamp bearing her father's initials. Silas picked up the letter and handed it to Eva. Her name was written on the front in Henry Mercer's neat, elegant cursive. "Your father wrote that in his cell 6 months before he died," Silas whispered. "He gave it to my father during a late-night shift at the county jail, begging him to deliver it to you when you were older. My father never gave it to you. He buried it here because he was terrified." Eva's fingers trembled so violently she could barely break the wax seal. As she unfolded the paper, her eyes swept over her father's familiar handwriting, tears immediately blurring her vision. "My dearest Evangeline," Henry had written. "If you are reading this, it means the truth has finally found its way out of the dark. I did not take Harrison Montgomery's money, nor did I set fire to the mill. I discovered 3 sets of books in Harrison's private safe, proof that he was laundering funds from local farmers and committing massive tax fraud. When I threatened to go to the federal prosecutor, he staged the fire to destroy the evidence and claim $50,000 in insurance. He framed me knowing no one in Oakhaven would take the word of a quiet accountant over a wealthy benefactor. Deputy Vance knows the truth. Harrison threatened to ruin his family, to destroy young Silas's future if Crane spoke up. I forgive Crane for his silence, for a father will do anything to protect his son. I only ask that you do not spend your life hating this town, my darling. Live, love, and be free." At the bottom of the page, in a rushed, shaky postscript, Henry had added one final line: "The real ledgers, the ones showing Harrison's arson payments, are sealed inside the hollow casing of my Seth Thomas pendulum clock. I hid them there the night before my arrest." Eva let the letter fall to her lap, a ragged sob tearing from her throat. The world seemed to tilt beneath her. 8 years of shame, 8 years of living as the daughter of a monster, shattered by a single piece of paper. But as the initial shock washed over her, a colder, sharper realization took its place. She looked at the letter, then at the deputy's logbook sitting in the tin box, and finally at Silas. "Your father knew," she whispered, her voice dripping with sudden venomous disbelief. "Your father knew my dad was innocent. He let him rot in a cell. He let him die in the cold, while Harrison Montgomery built his empire on our family's grave." "Ava, please." Silas reached out his hand, desperate. "Don't touch me." Ava shrank back against the truck door, tears spilling over her flushed cheeks. The realization cut deeper than any insult Mabel Puit had ever thrown at her. "For 3 years, Silas. 3 years you came to my house. You drank my coffee. You mended my roof. You looked at me like you cared about me. Was it all just guilt? Were you just trying to pay off your father's blood debt to the Mercer family?" "No." Silas's voice cracked, his own composure breaking, as he slammed a hand against the steering wheel in sheer agony. "I didn't know about the box until 2 nights ago, Eva. I swear on my life, I didn't know. I stayed around you because I loved you, because watching you carry that heavy cross alone broke my heart every single day." "You expect me to believe that?" Eva cried, clutching her father's letter to her chest, as if it were a shield. "Your family kept him in chains. Silas, and Harrison Montgomery is still out there walking free, offering to buy the very clock that holds the proof." She snatched the leather-bound logbook from the tin box, shoving the letter into her coat pocket, and grabbed the door handle. "Ava, wait! Where are you going?" Silas demanded, scrambling across the seat. "To get my father's clock," Eva said, her voice turning as hard and unforgiving as the Virginia ice outside, "and to tear Harrison Montgomery's world down to the ground." The morning sun rose crisp and clear over the Shenandoah Valley, casting a golden light across the snow-dusted orchards of Oakhaven. The violent storm that had battered the ridge for days had finally passed, leaving behind an absolute restorative quiet. Down at the county courthouse in Woodstock, the heavy oak doors had closed behind Harrison Montgomery late the previous evening. Stripped of his polished prestige, the wealthy industrialist had been led away in handcuffs after the state magistrate reviewed the damning evidence recovered from the hollow casing of Henry Mercer's Seth Thomas clock, the original fraudulent ledgers, alongside Deputy Crane Vance's detailed journal documenting the arson payoffs. Decades of deceit had crumbled in a matter of hours, sending shockwaves through the valley and exposing the dark corruption that had held Oakhaven in its grip for 8 long years. At the edge of town, the small churchyard of St. Mark's lay tranquil beneath a blanket of untouched white. For the first time in nearly a decade, the path leading to Henry Mercer's modest headstone was cleared of snow. Baskets of fresh white chrysanthemums and handwritten notes of apology rested against the marble base. Quiet tributes from townspeople like Mabel Puett, who had finally been forced to confront the terrible injustice they had allowed to flourish. Evangeline Mercer stood by her father's grave wrapped in her woolen coat, her breath rising in soft white plumes. She reached out her gloved fingers, gently brushing the carved letters of her father's name. The heavy iron band of shame that had constricted her chest for 8 years had vanished, replaced by a profound, peaceful stillness. Her father's memory was no longer buried beneath the lies of a powerful man or the cowardice of a quiet town. He was free, and so was she. A quiet crunch of snow behind her announced Silas Vance's arrival. He stopped a few paces away, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his canvas coat, his broad shoulders squared against the morning cold. He did not rush forward or offer flimsy excuses for the past. He simply stood there waiting with the same patient, steadfast presence that had defined his life. In his arms, wrapped carefully in a soft flannel cloth, he carried the Seth Thomas clock. Throughout the long, arduous night following Harrison's arrest, Silas had sat at his workbench meticulously cleaning the aged mahogany wood, recalibrating the internal brass gears, and repairing the pendulum until it swung with a steady, rhythmic beat once more. "I finished fixing it," Silas said softly, his deep voice carrying through the quiet graveyard air. The gears were rusted and binding, but the heart of it was still good. "It keeps perfect time now, Eva." Eva turned slowly to face him. Looking at Silas, she no longer saw the shadow of his father's tragic silence or the lingering ghosts of a painful past. She saw the man who had stayed by her side when the rest of the world had turned away, the man who had voluntarily carried the evidence to the magistrate, knowing it would tarnish his own family's name, simply because he believed she deserved the truth above all else. "Thank you, Silas," she murmured, taking a slow step toward him, "for restoring the clock, and for bringing my father home." Silas set the wrapped clock gently on a nearby stone bench and looked down at her. His dark eyes filled with an unreserved, vulnerable honesty. "I know I can't erase the years of pain my father's silence caused you, Eva, and I know I can never undo the weight you carried alone. But when I came to your house every morning, when I sat across from you with those tin cups of coffee, it was never out of guilt. I stayed because from the moment you looked at me with those fierce, unbroken eyes, I couldn't imagine a life where I didn't try to protect you. I stayed because I loved you long before I ever found that tin box." Eva looked into his face, feeling the last cold remnants of doubt melt away like the snow under the morning sun. The realization hit her with absolute clarity. Their bond had not been forged by a dead man's secret or a family's debt, but by 3 years of quiet, undeniable devotion. She reached out, placing her hand gently against his cheek. His skin was cold from the winter air, but his eyes radiated an overwhelming warmth. "I know, Silas," she whispered, a small, genuine smile finally breaking across her lips. "I think I've known all along." Together, they walked back down the winding hill toward the Mercer homestead. The red bank auction sign that had hung on the front gate was gone, pulled down, and discarded in the snow. Inside the house, Silas set the antique Seth Thomas clock upon the mantelpiece above the fireplace. He drew the pendulum back and let it go. The clock began to tick, a strong, steady, resonant heartbeat, echoing through the warm kitchen, marking the beginning of an unburdened chapter. Silas walked over to the stove, picked up the old coffee pot, and poured 2 tin cups, handing one to Eva just as he had done for 3 years. They walked out onto the front porch, standing side by side as the morning sun illuminated the vast expanse of the Shenandoah Valley. In the distance, the apple orchards lay quiet, waiting for the spring thaw that would soon bring white blossoms back to the trees. The journey had taken 8 years of heartbreak, a hidden box in a cold cabin, and a truth that nearly came too late. But as Eva took a sip of hot coffee and felt Silas's fingers lace securely through hers, she knew she was finally home. The most dangerous secret was never the one that could ruin a life. It was the truth held back so long that it almost cost 2 people the courage to stay. And standing beside Silas under the clear Virginia sky, Evangeline knew she would never have to run again.